One of my favorite um, uh, not jokes, but just funny things that I'll ask someone is, do you think that, like you look at a neon light bulb, neon, or that kind of thing, you can touch it, right? It's cold. But I'll say, do you believe me that the temperature inside that neon bulb is comparable to the temperature in the core of the sun? Most people would say, no way, right? But actually it is. The thing is, there just aren't very many molecules in there. So it doesn't transfer much heat to you. But they're plasma. They're like they're on the sun. They're moving that fast, but it's there has very little density. So you touch it, they don't transfer hardly any heat to you at all. So you have no perception of how really much energy there is on average. But like I say, high average kinetic energy, but if you don't have a lot of particles, then the total energy they're going to transfer to the surface of that bulb is not very much. Okay, so anyway, end of physics lesson. What is the metaphor? Well, you'll recall that Freud thought of the psyche in terms of pressures, because that was sort of the physics of the day. What I find interesting is that if you parse your mental experience into a visual component, which would be mental images, and an auditory component, which would be mental talk. When you start to do that, you're aware of images. A lot of times they vanish right away. You're aware of talk. Sometimes it just vanishes. But at some point, that sort of surface activity tends to go away. But the space, image space, is still there. Talk space is still there. And when you tune into image space or talk space, sometimes you're aware of a kind of subtle undercurrent of motion, like there's a kind of stirring in talk space. You may or may not be able to make out words, you may or may not be able to make out what the conversation is about, but there's a sort of undercurrent of activation. And there's something analogous to that in image space. And there can also be something analogous to that in your emotional centers. You're not actually experiencing any emotion per se, but it's like there's something sort of idling down there. So what is that? A lot of times people will sort of look upon that as a problem. It's like, I can't get rid of that sort of undercurrent of something going on down there. Well, what that is subconscious visual thought, subconscious auditory thought, and subliminal emotional sensation. And if you explore your inner space, image space, talk space, emotional body space, when after the surface stuff is sort of dissipated, and you're watching that general level of stirring down there, sometimes it's uniform. It just sort of is at a constant pace, okay? Other times, it sort of speeds up and then subsides, sort of bursts and then subsides. Subsides, subside. So, although you're not aware of the specific content necessarily of the subconscious, you are monitoring, by monitoring that general level of activation. Do you see the metaphor? You're taking the temperature of the subconscious. You're monitoring sort of metaphorically the average kinetic energy that's going on. And if the temperature is more or less constant, it's all sort of at the same frequency, then what's optimal is to evenly cover subjective space and just let your awareness sort of soak into that whole field. And what that's going to tend to do is break up it's going to lessen the viscosity. So density, viscosity, temperature, entropy, these are called state variables. And these are sort of this is the great achievement of 19th century physics. One of the great achievements is statistical thermodynamics. So there are these state variables. So if it's more or less like an even level of vibratory activity, then you sort of cover the whole space, you soak awareness into it, you don't try to figure out what's going on, you give it permission to just sort of move around down there. And you'll find that that will cause that system to become more and more fluid, meaning less and less viscous. On the other hand, if you notice pattern that it sort of activates and then deactivates, so it sort of like heats up and then suddenly cools off, metaphorically. What's optimal in that case is to watch the sort of burst of energy and then detect the gone, and briefly look down the valley where those little bubbles went to, because they're pointing right to nirvana, right to cessation. So you get gone, 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 gone. If it gives you that pattern, then get interested in the rhythm of arising, passing, but this is subtle vibration, sort of shimmering and then dying away. And when that foam sort of dies away, the silence that it points to is the absolute rest, the still point of the turning world. So there's a metaphor from good old 19th century physics. I mentioned that, so in my mind, I think of this as, wow, how cool is this? If Freud had only known, you can actually take the temperature in real time of the subconscious mind. And in doing so, the viscosity of the subconscious gets worked through. And when the subconscious self, the psyche, this inner see, hear, feel self, when it flows, it gets creative and liberated. So that's one of my favorite metaphors, taking the temperature of the unconscious in real time as a function of space. The temperature of this room is what a scientist would call a scalar field. It means, or a time-varying scalar field. It means at each point in the space of this room, there's a physical quantity that can be measured by one real number, which is temperature. And it's a temperature field, a scalar field that varies with time. So the subconscious is actually analogous to a temperature field, because it has location. There's the visual part, the auditory part, the emotional body part, and so forth.